All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Addressing Philadelphia's Gun Violence Epidemic. My name is Mark Hauk, the Grants and Impact Analyst for the Stoneleigh Foundation, and I'll be your technician for today's event. Before we begin, please know that we will be setting aside some time at the end of today's discussion for audience questions. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window on a computer, or it will appear at the top right of an iPad or phone screen. You can type your question into the Q&A button box that appears at any time. If you do so, please include your name and organization with your question so that we can identify you for our speakers. Now, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's event, Stoneleigh Foundation's Deputy Director, Marie Williams.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. As Mark said, I am Marie Williams, Deputy Director at the Stoneleigh Foundation. Welcome to Perspectives on Gun Violence, Schools, Community, Police, and Public Health. In our communities, in our schools, among law enforcement, and in the public health field, we're all asking ourselves, what can we do about the gun violence epidemic? And the same question is being asked in the world of philanthropy, including certainly at the Stoneleigh Foundation. For more than a decade, the foundation has supported fellows working at the intersection of systems, serving young people, families, and communities. And inevitably, we've confronted questions about the causes, the effects, and of course, the solutions to gun violence. In the past year, the conversations about Philadelphia's gun violence epidemic have grown even louder and the voices more numerous, potentially creating room for misconceptions about the positions and the motivations of various stakeholders. Today, we've invited some of those voices and stakeholders here to clarify their perspectives, debunk some of those misconceptions, and discuss pathways toward what we're all seeking, solutions. I'm joined by Andre Sims from the Youth, Art, and Self-Empowerment Project, Dr. Nicholas Smith-Kea, Stoneleigh Fellow and Executive in Residence at the Philadelphia Police Department, Kevin Bethel, Chief Safety Officer at the School District of Philadelphia, and last but certainly not least, Dr. Ruth Abaya, a physician, researcher at the Department of Public Health and a Stoneleigh Fellow. Welcome, everyone. So we'll be together for about 90 minutes this afternoon, give or take. There will be about an hour of conversations among the panelists, followed by questions from the audience, and then we'll have a closing word from Ronnie Bloom, Stoneleigh's Executive Director. With that, let's get started. So, Andre, I'd like to start with you. You're a well-known activist and lead organizer at the Youth, Art, and Self-Empowerment Project here in Philadelphia. And YASP has long advocated for justice reform, for the rights for young people with criminal and juvenile justice system involvement, and notably for ending cash bail. Another of YASP's goals is to combat the culture of violence in Philadelphia. One perception about advocacy organizations like YASP, which champion the rights of the accused, is that your work stands at odds with law enforcement and at odds with public safety in general. In other words, by helping those charged with or serving time for sometimes violent offenses, including those involving the presence or use of a firearm, the argument is sometimes made that you're actually working counter to the cause of preventing community violence. Can you help those of us who are sympathetic with your overarching goal of a fair, just, and equitable justice system to better understand how your work to help keep young people charged with gun-related offenses out of detention or reduce sentences for offenses where a firearm is used or present can actually be consistent with combating community violence?
Absolutely. Working to end youth incarceration is actually in the best interest of public safety. And I can use my experience as an example for that. I was incarcerated at the age of 17, served 8 years in adult prison for a violent crime. While I was inside, I struggled with anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and I was forced into this constant state of fight or flight. I wasn't able to grow as a person because I was focused solely on survival. And it wasn't until I was introduced to community organizations that helped me heal, educate myself, and find my purpose. And so now, as you said, I'm the lead youth organizer for the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project, where I help lead the first youth-focused participatory defense hub in the country. And now I use my experience to advocate for transforming Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system, while we're simultaneously working to develop other youth leaders through our program. And because of YAS, I was able to transform my life as well as the life of others. And now, with their help, I've started my own nonprofit where we're combating gun violence by targeting the culture. We're paying local artists to create socially responsible music and poetry. And so statistics tell us that young people who are incarcerated are actually more likely to get rearrested after the release. You know, statistics show us that the majority of people in prison will end up going back to prison. Statistics prove time and time again that the system does not work if we're talking about public safety. So working to reduce sentences for young people and working to keep young people out of detention means working to create real solutions and working to give young people the resources and the support that they need to thrive.
So it sounds like you're saying, Andre, that in your personal experience and in the experience of other young people, the incarceration experience did not teach you very much of anything. It didn't gain you much of anything until you were released and you were able to receive services from community-based organizations like YAS. So, are you, is your claim that without incarceration, young people, even those who may be charged with violent offenses, might be better rehabilitated in the community?
Absolutely. When I went to prison, when I was in detention, I learned how to be a better criminal. I didn't learn how to heal. I didn't learn how to transform. You know, I wasn't thinking about my actions, what I've done. I wasn't able to heal because I was in this constant state of survival, thinking about, you know, am I going to be harmed? What do I have to do to survive to make it to the next meal? When you support young people, give young people the resources that they need, when they're in the community and involved in doing this work, when you empower young people, that's where the real change comes from.
Thank you. I'm guessing based on what you've said that there are going to be a lot of questions and reactions even from the other panelists. So I'm going to leave room for that, but move on to a perspective that is sometimes seen as being at odds with your perspective as a community organizer. So Nikki, you're a Stoneleigh Fellow and Executive in Residence at the Philadelphia Police Department, working on strategies to promote positive police-community relations, officer wellness, and public safety. Having worked in many jurisdictions around the country, it surprises you, I'm sure, not at all, that the relationship between police and community, particularly when facing a crisis like Philadelphia's gun violence epidemic, often worsens rather than improves, even though the circumstances call for greater cooperation and collaboration. In fact, it's often during times of crisis like this that we're seeing in Philadelphia that communities grow more alert to the potential for law enforcement overreaching and abuse. So what would you say to community members, including those who do organizing and advocacy like Andre, about the role of policing and positive community relations during crises, such as the one we're facing? Are there common misconceptions or community beliefs about law enforcement's role that are important for you to unpack and discredit?
Yeah, thank you, Marie, for your question. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I've been having this conversation with folks in the PD, with community members, outside of the police department around the country for a while now on the importance of collaboration. I often start with 3 words: acknowledgement, communication, and collaboration. I mean, there's no denying that policing in the United States has a complicated and sordid history. And I think until we acknowledge that, it's going to be difficult for us to move forward. And in the recent past, we've heard more about the history of policing in the US, more so than ever before. So we are hearing a lot, and I'm not here to take us through that history. What I will say is that we won't know where we are going until we've acknowledged and understand our past. And I'll bring a name forward that everyone on this call is probably familiar with, your own Charles Ramsey, who was a former commissioner of police, and also chaired the President's Task Force for 21st Century Policing, he talks about the troubled relationships between police and many communities today. And he reiterated that we must understand the history of policing. We must acknowledge that law enforcement has not always stood on the right side of justice. And we know that issues of policing are fraught with apprehension and mistrust and divisiveness. And Ramsey argued back then, and it still holds true today, that law enforcement needs to shift its perceived mission from one of enforcing the law to one of protecting the rights of all. So I encourage, I look forward to having conversations with folks like Andre and others who are in the advocacy space, because that conversation needs to happen. There's absolutely an argument. And again, I'm in a unique position, and I normally start with this, and I should have. I'm Black female, I'm Jamaican, I'm an immigrant. And I'm often asked, what am I doing in this space? And I say I'm in this space because I am genuinely hopeful that change is possible. But I also argue that it's not possible unless we work collaboratively. The minute we think that what we're experiencing right now is a policing issue, is the minute that we'll fail. And so how do we have these conversations? How do we work collaboratively? How do we hold all entities accountable? And again, I encourage Andre and those in that space to absolutely push at police, because there are things that need to be answered. There are arguments that American policing, of course, is built on racism, and the profession is defined by structural racism. And there's no denying there are inequities both inside and outside of the profession. And that comes with a lot of baggage. And particularly in racially diverse communities. So you mentioned earlier about just everything that we're experiencing now and the reality within communities that people are possibly even moving further away from having a relationship with police. And I think that's one myth, I would argue it's a myth that we need to understand in many situations. And the city has been doing a number of community listening sessions. The PD in the last year, and since I've been here, we've had youth conversations, a procedurally just youth engagement opportunity for youth to have a voice. And what we hear when we go into these communities is that these individuals who are truly affected and impacted by the crime, by the crime wave that we're seeing, by the everything that we're seeing, they're asking for protection. They're asking for folks to be there to help them. So I think that's one thing I think we need to have as a community. We need to have a conversation to understand what is needed. It's easy for us from where we sit to say there are too many police shouldn't be in certain spaces. But when you go to these communities that are really impacted, they're asking for more, and they're saying what they're asking for is for it to be done equitably and with procedural justice in mind. So treating people with dignity and respect, giving individuals voice during encounters, being neutral and transparent in decision-making, and conveying trustworthiness. And I can talk forever, so let me stop at this point.
Thank you. I'm going to invite the other panelists and also invite you and Andre to have a little bit of conversation, because I think you both raised really interesting points. One point that you just raised, Nikki, that I think is interesting and provocative is you said you think it's a myth that the community and police and law enforcement are moving farther away, as evidenced by community voices saying we need more help and protection. Just playing devil's advocate for a minute, I wonder whether or not in asking for more protection, they're actually asking for more police. I feel like these are not synonymous terms in terms of the community. They want more intervention, they want more resources, they want more help, but I'm not sure that that is equated in their minds to wanting more police. I'm gonna ask Andre to jump in on that. And then I'm also mindful of the fact that we have with us the former deputy police commissioner. I'm sure he's jumping out of his seat wanting to respond both to what Andre said and what you said as well, Nikki. But Andre, you go first, and then maybe if you have something to say, and then maybe Kevin, if you would like to as well. you could address it.
Maria, I think you said it perfectly. Protection is not necessarily synonymous with policing. You know, we're working right now within the community where we're trying to organize young people to, police themselves. And so protection could be resources, protection could be education. There's so many levels. It's not necessarily synonymous with police in our communities. I think what is important is that we definitely continue to push back on the narratives that we need police in our communities. What we need is what they portray, what they symbolize: protection, law for all, healthy environment, protecting the law. I love that you said that, Nikki, that we need to, move away from uplifting, holding law enforcement in a sight of seeing it as, protecting law and order and protecting the rights of people. That's what we need. We need our rights protected, and I think everybody can agree with that. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're all agreeing on what that looks like right now. And I think the work is to come together and really figure out what is true protection, what is true safety, what is true healing in our community.
Thanks for that, Andre. And Kevin, I'm gonna be asking you a question next. So this might be a good time for you to jump in to respond to what you've heard, and then we'll segue to your question from your current perspective as Chief Safety Officer at the school district.
I think, it's one thing to say, we don't want the police to respond to these, but, at the same token, we have a community that doesn't step up and want to fill that void either, right? I mean, for example, I ask for people to come around my schools and protect my kids leaving the corridors, and I don't get volunteers to the point I have to pay for people to do that. There's 65,000 offenses that happen in the city of Philadelphia and 2.5 million calls of service to 911. The community has for decades and decades been, programmed to call that 911. And so, you pull it out without any of the, I understand that, but the part of the process, you have to build it and then pull it out, not just pull it out and expect, like, who responds when our ladies are being domestic abuse? Like when they're getting beat at home, who are we going to call when someone sticks a gun in my mother-in-law's face and says, give me your money? Who is going to respond to all of these other offenses that also challenge our neighborhoods and our communities? And so, I understand that, but the reality is not to have an infrastructure to fill that gap and then just say, pull that gap out. We've kind of left our communities like in this space, like, well, who's coming? Calling 911, it takes you 20 minutes for the phone to pick up and maybe not get a response. Like, I mean, we should have, it's not an either or. We can do that together, but we didn't have the infrastructure to fill that gap either.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and the subject of a lot of conversations, right? Especially around defunding or de-emphasizing police. The question of what and how, if we were to accept that proposition, we replace that gap or supplement that space. But, and Kevin, you and I can and have talked many, many times about the role of police in communities, but you're now sitting in a somewhat different space as a Chief Safety Officer at the school district. As I mentioned before, you're former Deputy Police Commissioner, and of course, we love to claim you a former Stoneleigh Fellow and a current Stoneleigh board member. So as part of your role at SDP, you guide the school district's efforts to create and maintain safe, supportive environments for students. As a Stoneleigh Fellow, you developed an interruption of the school to justice pathway by diverting students from being referred to the juvenile justice system to instead receive services for themselves and their families, which was extraordinary work, which Stoneleigh was very, very proud to support. But, looking at where you are today and what you're facing today, one of the aspects of the gun violence crisis that troubles the community, and I know troubles you as well, is the relative youth of both the victims and the alleged perpetrators of gun violence in Philadelphia. This might mean often that the young people involved are either of school age or fairly recently out of school. So are there gaps and inefficiencies in the school's approach to gun violence? So in other words, in defining gun violence as a community problem, has the school district, have we collectively, not just the school district, missed opportunities to have the school district be part of the solution?
That's a heavy question, as you know, right? And well, first so I'm kind of, maybe I'll closet it all together because I don't think I'll break it off into parts, because first and foremost, I believe that the school district and the schools are the community, right? I don't separate those two. You know, as a young man growing up, you know, raised by a single mother and with 4 boys during the gang war days, I went to John Bartram High School. It was part of our community, and it was a safe place, regardless of what was going on around the community, what was going on in the community. When we walked through it, one thing when I touched that was like the Holy Grail, you know, and one of the challenges I've faced, and which is an awesome task to put on school leaders, is now to say that place that used to educate us now also has to be the beacon for dealing with the issues around gun violence. You know, as I shared with you in an earlier conversation, sometimes we do target it. First and foremost, I always say the glass is half full. The majority of our young people that we engage every day across the city of Bethel do exactly what they do and what they're supposed to do, right? I mean, we sometimes focus on our young people. I mean, the reality is very few of them, as Andre talked about, will go through this process, will not get engaged, will go on to be successful, and is unfortunate about his incident spending that much time, because severity it's not about severity. You know, there's enough evidence to say the severity doesn't change anything. But that being said, I think for us as a school district, you know, it's all been proportional as the numbers have increased across the city. You know, when I was there, it was 242 homicides, 1,300 shootings, and those numbers we've gotten proportionally. So most of the violence across the city has been in that 9 or 10% of the violence that you see is associated with juveniles. The majority of that is individuals over 18. But the reality is us as an organization last year had 304 students who were active students who were shot in our school district, and 47 active students who were shot who were killed in our system. And so when you think about that, you know, the district, we have worked hard to try to figure out how do we pivot now from this place that, you know, was really just around, you know, we have teachers who are scared to death sometimes because of the violence that happens around the schools that they're in. And so we've been introducing those activities to fill that gap. I know our Relationship First is a comprehensive restorative program in our support services and our Office of Prevention and Intervention. Like each of those incidences where a kid has been shot, we respond. They respond to support those families in a trauma-informed approach to see what the needs are and how we can help them. And then, you know, in my office, beyond just doing the diversion, you know, we're really filling in there doing mentoring. We're mentoring at 30 of our schools. We're mentoring kids who are transitioning back from placement, but because we felt when they came back to our school, they were struggling to re-enter into the school. And then it was like, oh, that's the kid, that's the bad kid. Well, we said, no, we want to embrace those young people and make them feel welcomed in that space. So when they come in, they're more settled into there. I mean, we're doing PAL centers. I mean, I'm going after some of my more challenging schools and to really try to fill what is I don't even call it a gap anymore. Like it's this huge, pressure and it's a huge hole, because the downstream impact of when we don't address gun violence in the city in a comprehensive and effective way, this is what happens now. Like last year we responded, we have threat assessment response team now, where kids are coming into school saying, I'm going to shoot somebody, because they use the language of the street now, right? Or they talk on social media. And oftentimes it's not meant for them to say it that way, but they send us social media, I'm going to put you down tomorrow. So we created a threat assessment team, and I have social workers, 2 social workers, a crisis management response team to go out and evaluate what that looks like. We did 225 last year, and we're already we have 100 so far, and the school just started. And so the constant pressure. So I listen, I think the gap started a long time ago when we underfunded our schools, right? And so we can talk about that disparity is in that gap, and how education has been a critical role in that space. But I also say that our school leaders you know, I can't be more proud of the work that they do. I've been on both sides of it now. I've been on the side of law enforcement, and I'm on the side of an organization that every day is trying to figure out how do we support our young kids and our children who come into our space, many of them with some of the most egregious traumas that you can ever imagine. I've often shared with you, I grew up poor, but when I became a cop and I went through the doors, then I realized, no, I wasn't that poor. I thought I was poor. You know what I mean? When I talk about trauma, pull it up by your bootstraps. I came out of the neighborhood until I meet some kids and I'm saying, oh my gosh, I didn't go through what Andre went through. I didn't go through what some of these children have gone through. You know what I mean? And so it is an absolute challenge to now put on the school leaders, because I think there's this effort now to say, hey, well, the school district, you will be the solver of all those. And I think there's things obviously, within the system that can be done. But how do you take, principals and school leaders and folks who give their lives to educate our children and now say, hey, how do you go out in the community and stop a kid who's been shot? More importantly, how do I stop individuals now to come up my school and murder one of my students? And how do we as a city also say, had that happened anywhere else in America, it would have been an active shooter, and every news station in America would have been in front of Roxborough talking about Nicholas who died at Saul. How do we walk into a place and we just say, hey, we do a news conference, and the next day we wash off the blood and we keep on moving? So there's gaps, and if we see the school as a community and a beacon for that area of hope, then we need to start treating it that way. And folks have to get more involved in what it means to be a part of the community. And so we have a lot of work to do. And I know you have some very educated folks on this panel and the listening audience who probably have greater answers than me, but we need to have real talk about real issues and real solutions about what we're going to do now. Because, we can talk about programs that may have impact 10 years ago, but that's not saving the lives of the young people we're losing every day.
Thanks for that, Kevin. And something you said early on really, struck me, that schools are the community. And that's, a good reminder and a caution against the inclination we have to create silos of response to the gun violence problem. You also talked about, having difficulty finding volunteers to help, safe passage and things of that nature. And I have a feeling, just by virtue of being on the same panel with Andre, that you might, hear from folks who are interested in participating in that process with you. But I'm going to move on to Dr. Ruth Abaya. It's no accident that I put it's sort of symbolic, actually, that I put the question about research around public health last, because sadly, that's often where it's relegated in conversations about the gun violence epidemic. We want something done right away. We want it done now. And the very last thing on the list is often research. So Ruth, in addition to being a pediatrician at CHOP, you're a researcher at the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, working to create a registry of people who experienced fatal and non-fatal firearm injuries, and examine the extent to which they connected with services. Your research will have ongoing relevance to how the city can interrupt and address the gun violence epidemic. Despite this, it's often difficult for lay people, myself included, until I had the benefit of having many conversations with you. It's difficult for us to see the essential nature of research, not just as a long-term proposition, but in immediate or rapid approaches to the gun violence epidemic. So talk to us a little bit about why it's important to support and advocate for gun violence research with as much urgency as we do for other responses to the epidemic. What, for instance, are these knowledge gaps that, Kevin, not just service gaps, but knowledge gaps that are slowing or hampering our response to the current gun violence epidemic in Philadelphia and around the country, actually?
Thanks, Marie. I really appreciate the question. And I wanted to start by acknowledging
the sentiment that I think informs that question, which is that research hasn't always done its job as far as its responsibility to those that are being researched. So I just want to start by acknowledging that history. I think a lot of people perceive research as being for the benefit of the researchers and the universities who are getting funding to ask a lot of the same questions over and over. And what is not seen is the tangible results and the successful implementation of the findings in community. And so that's the history. Similar to what Dr. Nikki said about the history of policing, I think we have to start from a place of honesty about what sometimes happens, not always, but what sometimes happens when communities are researched. Having said that, I think my take-home line about this would be that research has the potential to distinguish activity from progress. And so it's possible to have a lot of activity. And I would argue Philadelphia has a lot of activity around violence prevention and response. But is that really progress? Just because, I'll use a medical analogy, just because, you know, a doctor is doing a lot of interventions doesn't mean they're making you healthier, right? And so one of the things we need to understand that research helps us to understand is, are we actually doing things that are addressing the core issue? Both preventing it and responding to it in a meaningful and effective way. And so research answers some very critical basic questions. What is actually happening? So sometimes there are basic misconceptions about what's happening. People will say things like, most of the gun victims and perpetrators are 19. No, they're not actually, right? Or people are using community guns, or the guns that we're getting are coming from the South. Actually, a lot of the Philadelphia weapons are sourced right here in Pennsylvania. So if we don't actually understand the problem, we're going to come up with solutions that are irrelevant. So what is actually happening? Research is how you get to that. The other question is, what works to fix it? So there's some things that may sound good, right? There are a lot of things that you could propose. We are going to fix violence by doing this. But if those interventions have not been tested and shown to be effective, then again, activity, not progress. And so research can use scientific methodology to say, okay, we tried this. What's the outcome we expected? Did we see that outcome? Can we address the things that confounded that outcome? Other things that happened at the same time, or other things that might have affected that? And then some details, like what was the time frame for that response? Did it make a difference in 2 months? Did it make a difference in 2 years? Was that difference sustained, right? Research is just a method to answer these basic questions. And then finally, how's it going? And so we may do something, and the thing we're doing is a good thing. And I should say, we don't always have to study things. It's kind of like eating your vegetables. We don't need to do more research to show that it's good to eat your vegetables. We don't need to do more research to show that, you know, ready access to guns is a problem, or having a lot of unresolved trauma is a problem. We don't need to keep asking the same questions over and over again. But when we devise interventions to respond to those things, are they working? Research is just a tool to answer that question. And it forces you to kind of probe, what does working mean? Does working mean less shootings? Does it mean that more people are being arrested less frequently? Do we think something is working if it's just engaging a certain number of people or the right types of people? That very critical question of what does working mean, research is like a good tool to answer it collectively and say, okay, this is what we think working is. And is this working or not in a statistically significant way? So the other thing I'll say about research is, I do think there's some really practical, and Marie and I have spoken about this, implications for certain research findings that we just don't implement, right? So implementation research is a whole field. And the whole idea there is that there's finding out something works, and then there's figuring out how to actually make it attractive, acceptable, practical, usable on the ground. That's actually research too, right? And so one example is, I'm going to give 2 examples. One is gun locks. So sure, if people's weapons are safely secured, that seems like it would make a difference in reducing violence. But a lot of people have questions about whether or not people who are more frequently engaged in violence are going to be, you know, using a sophisticated gun lock. So that's a question that could be answered. What would motivate you to lock your weapon? Why do you carry it, right, in your waistband versus kind of having it in your home? What are the decisions that you're making that
facilitate you having a weapon on you, which is really the critical step to using it in a moment of like heatedness. So I think that research helps us to answer those questions. Another example I really want to give is about, for example, greening. So very understandably, I think there are a lot of community members who would say, you know, people are dying, people are being traumatized, entire communities are being devastated. The solution of planting a tree does not feel like it is sufficient to the moment, right? But research tells us that when you do specific types of blight remediation and greening activities, there is a measurable, significant reduction in violence that occurs within, 18 months. So it's not, while it might seem like a kumbaya, irrelevant, you're going to plant a tree that's not going to do anything, research helps us see, no, we're seeing a reduction in the number of shootings in places where we do a specific intervention, not just any old greening, but a specific type of intervention has been shown to have this impact in this time frame. So it takes things from feeling irrelevant to maybe actually being meaningful solutions. And then it helps us figure out whether or not we're doing those things well. And the other word that I just wanted to leave us with before I stop talking is reach. So we have programs in Philadelphia. In fact, Philadelphia has exported a lot of ideas around violence prevention to other municipalities historically. Whether it's hospital-based violence intervention or cure violence, we have these programs, group violence intervention, we have them in Philadelphia. Who are they touching of the denominator of people that they're supposed to be touching or aimed for? Is a difficult question to answer, right? Because a lot of these programs are housed in specific institutions and they can measure their institutional reach, but what's our reach in the city? So I think that research and the goal kind of my project is to say, what is the reach of programs that have a basis for being thought of as effective? Are we reaching people? And then is it working? And can we sit down with the practitioners of these models who are the experts to define what working is? And I want to propose working definitely needs to mean a reduction in homicides and shooting victims. That's so important. But working can also mean that people who didn't previously have employment now have employment. People who didn't previously have access to mental health supports now have mental health supports. People are connected to basic services and amenities that they were eligible for, but were not previously connected to. Those kind of outcomes matter as kind of precursors to now this person is no longer at increased risk of being engaged in violence. And I think the city has a unique vantage point to be able to say how we're doing as a city, where each institution is doing, a great job of looking at how they're doing as an institution. Our question is, how are we doing as a city? And then if we find that our reach is less than it could be, we have more capacity than reach, how do we facilitate connections to things that work? And when we, and the way we know that they work ultimately is research. So hopefully that's helpful, but that's what I would say in response to that.
Great, that's actually very helpful. And I want to invite any of our other panelists to sort of jump in to address specifically this question that you raised, Ruth, of whether or not we need a broader definition or view of what the gun violence problem is. Is it a problem of underinvestment in certain places? Is it a problem of lack of access to behavioral health? And that, maybe we ought to think of it not only as a problem that manifests, well, it manifests that way, but it's not only defined by people losing their lives at the hands of guns. But I also want to, before the rest of you jump in as part of the conversation, sort of flag that, we've reached the part where I'd love for us to infuse some sense of solutions into the conversation. Like, what are some of the solutions to the problems that we've raised that you all have think are sort of missing or underutilized? Like, what are some of the gaps that you've identified in your own work? And I think Ruth elevated a really big one in my mind, that we're being too narrow in our definition of what the gun violence problem is and looks like and how it manifests. So I'm inviting anybody who feels a burning need to jump in right now.
I don't mind. I'll just, if I could jump in real quick, but I was in a session with a young man and he said something that was pretty, it was just simple, basic, but he said, you know, there's no counter programming. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but he says, you know, the street is talking to our kids all the time, whether it be drill rap, whether it be, you know, whatever it is, the street knows how to capture our kids and hold their attention. But he said, where is the counter programming to all of that? You know what I mean? And so I think in addition to what Dr. Abaya talks about these, you know, all of these different groups, you know what I mean, what is that? Like there was a time when we, you know, we were together, right? It was this collective effort that we're going to address the gun issue on all facets. It wasn't just a policing strategy, because research told us that if we went to the dots and went to these specific areas and police those areas, the numbers would come down. And guess what? It comes at a cost, but it worked because the research said that's where we should do it. You know what I mean? But I think, you know, again, you know, we can have those conversations, but I think I think this oftentimes is not this counter programming around, you know, who knows and what's going on. But other thing that Dr. Abaya raised, and one of the programs that I was involved with almost 20 years ago was called a Weed and Seed program. You know, and in the Weed and Seed program, you know, policing we would go into the area when, so Dr. Abaya talked about greening. I can remember a park down in Kensington where, you know, the sister wants to take the park back. And so we go in and we move folks out the park, but they brought in resources to teach the community how to activate, like how to give them the tools and the skills and the capacity to be able to say, we're going to own this park. You know, and so as we were doing our policing, they were doing their mobilizing. As they got better and stronger, we would pull back and we pull back. And within a period of time, guess what? 6 months, 7 months, 8 months later, we're done. We're out and they own the park. You know, and so I think some of that, you know, when we talk about engaging the community, I think we can't make these assumptions that many of our communities, particularly our economic communities, know how to activate. You know, many of our communities consist of people who own our house. You go through a block and 90% of the block is owned by people who don't even live in the city. And so when we say community, you know, I mean, we have to also understand, what are we talking about when we go through significant pockets of our more impoverished neighborhoods where it's nothing but, you know, it's rental homes and there's not home ownership and people are coming and going and being very transient. And so I think we really, you know, to that earlier point, you know, when we start to broaden the scope of what gun violence looks like, why is it happening in these particular areas, you know, and what is really needed. And I'll find with this, we do these grants, but no one wants to touch the harder kids, the harder individuals. Everybody wants to touch the easier one. So it's easy for me to talk about, I'll do mentoring with a 10-year-old child. It's hard to bring that 22-year-old young man in there who has had a lot of trauma. He's got a lot of baggage, a lot of issues, and work with him. Most of our programs do not work with the individuals who need it the most. And so I think we need
Kevin, I'm gonna challenge that, because I suspect
Yeah.
Andre might have information that either confirms or counters what you just said. But also, I think on the issue of counter programming, which for me sounds precisely like what the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project is about. And I know they're not unique in the city of Philadelphia, in that they work in that way. So I'd love for Andre to jump in and talk about that, and also respond to what I think you're describing, Kevin, which is that programs like YASP that have a really healthy relationship with the community, and even with those so-called tough cases, are not necessarily recognized and well-resourced, particularly with public money. But Andre, you can tell me if I'm wrong.
I think you have a great point. I want to thank Kevin for what he said as far as stating that there's not enough counter programming. You know, I think that's true. There is not enough. Yes, can only do but so much. And so I think that it's important that we focus on, you know, the culture of crime and really trying to impact that. We have to be conscious about what we're consuming as a people and conscious about what we're contributing to society. You know, in my experience, we also don't pay enough attention to the root causes of violence. We spend over $200,000 to incarcerate a young person compared to the average $16,000 we invest on their education. we've failed young people, and we failed to address the impacts of ancestral trauma, but we want to respond to the addictions, the gun violence, but we don't get down to the root causes. Our communities need healing, not more punishment. And so I've also noticed that we've identified this issue of gun violence as being a youth problem. I've seen too often young people being targeted and vilified as being perpetrators of this violence, but what I'm not seeing enough of is young people having opportunities to be involved in the solutions. We need to tap into the expertise that young people have and allow them to lead us to real solutions. And that's what we're doing. Yes, that's what we're building. We define youth as young people under 30 years old, because we know that stages in the 20s, like you said, Kevin, we don't want to have those conversations with, kids that we look at as adults, the kids that we've abandoned, but they need that support. They need those resources as well. And so just allowing our young people to lead, giving them the resources that they need, that's how we're going to get through this. We're not going to have any meaningful impact without this. There's a saying, nothing about us without us. We have to have young people at the table.
So I've heard so far, Nikki, I'll give you a moment after. I just want to stick a pin in 2 points that I've heard so far. So in terms of solutions, I've heard that there needs to be more counter programming. There needs to be work addressing the culture of crime, that kids need to be told more than don't pick up the gun. They need to be told what they pick up instead, right? There needs to be an alternative. I've also heard that there needs to be a broader definition of what the gun violence problem is that includes some discussion of root causes. And I'm gonna pause to do a shout out to Jessica Beard, another of Stonelegh's fellows, who is working on a communications focused project to do that very thing, sort of broaden the conversation about the root causes of gun violence, particularly around television news. So I've heard a couple of solutions, but Nikki, I'm gonna let you both respond to what you've heard, and then also chime in on whether or not there are any frameworks that you can think of for thinking about and talking about the epidemic that we're missing or that are underutilized, and that might be helpful as we try to think about how to solve it.
Yeah. And Marie, I mentioned this jokingly, but I really think this conversation needs to continue beyond today, because there's so much that we can talk amongst ourselves. For me, it's not just a broadening of the definition, but a consensus definition. We continue and we remain and we work in silos. There isn't a consensus on what the problem is. And that, I think, is a major part of the problem. And all the right persons are not at the table. And I'm very sensitive to this as a Jamaican. And I'll give an example. I taught at the university back home, and I recalled white men coming to Jamaica to tell us what our problem was. They didn't ask the community. They came in to fix the problem. And we're doing that here as well. We have people sitting in offices, sitting in at certain spaces, and telling communities what their problem is and telling communities what their solution is. And we haven't engaged communities systematically enough. I won't say we haven't fully, but systematically enough to get them involved in a part of the problem solving. I would also push back a little and say there are counter programming out there. We just don't know what they are, because nobody, again, is doing a systematic collection or intervention of what exists out there. Right? I often say, if we thought that policing is the only reason why crime is down, we're sorely mistaken. It's down because also there are programs like YAS, and there are so many other programs that are not being funded properly, and people are doing it on a shoestring budget. And so Kevin also mentioned the impact of granting, which is also a part of the problem, both at the federal level, the state level, how things are granted, and the politics behind this granting. So we grant based on a brand name. We grant and with very restrictive solutions. And so people on the ground who are actually doing the work aren't able to braid and blend funds, meaning they're very restricted in how they use things. And I'm giving more problems than solutions right now, because I think, again, we need to have the conversation and have a consensus definition about what it is that we're looking at and where the gaps are and what are some of the problems that are seeming solutions. I will support what Ruth said earlier. We have to have support evidence-based research around evidence-based interventions, and that isn't supported properly at any level. I also want to support what Ruth said in the sense that certain things we don't need to study anymore. We know what the problem is. We know what the problem is. But again, how are we coming together to determine the solution and tracking the progress of that solution?
So Nikki, you said something that struck me. You talked about evidence-based programs. And in the same discussion, you talked a lot about smaller programs not being able to access funding. And I suspect that in her work, Ruth, as she's looked at service providers who work with victims of gun violence, we've talked about some challenges they've had around collecting data that will prove their efficacy. And the lack of that data then leading to their inability to prove to funders that their project or their program or their organization has an evidence base. And so it becomes this cyclical issue of the mom and pop, highly effective service providers, even though they may not even be benefited with that label, right? Actually never being able to bring to scale, another troubling phrase for smaller programs, their approach. So Ruth, talk to us a little bit about what you've seen of that phenomenon and how we might solve it. Because again, you know, it is tempting for us to list the problems because there are many, but again, trying to refocus a little bit on solutions. Ruth, have you seen what I described, and are there any thoughts that you might have about how we might solve some of that?
Yeah, so definitely have seen that. And there are definitely programs which, when you're introduced to them, it seems highly plausible that at the right dose, they would affect violence. They have such great knowledge of their local community, such great insight into the drivers in their kind of hyper-local area. And it feels plausible. So my opinion is, just to orient around solutions, that any funding or any funding entity, any grant-making organization should have a focus on not just established programs that are evidence-based, making sure they're funded, but an innovation fund, for lack of a better term, right? So how are you funding both established programs and their expansion and their implementation? And how are you funding innovation, which requires evaluation, right? So if you're innovating, you have to have the right partnerships to allow those who are innovating to learn about the impact of their own work. This, to me, raises a very important potential solution, which is two important solutions. So one is partnerships, and the other is professionalization. So for partnerships, we're not going to get to the point where a small organization that subserves 15 young people in a very small part of West Philadelphia is going to be able to do a randomized control trial of the impact of their work necessarily. But there are plenty of people who have that expertise in the city of meds and eds, right? And so if there are people who have that expertise, I think it's an obligation of local universities and other partners to find those linkages and provide that technical support. You don't have to do your own evaluation. You don't have to become a researcher if your expertise is that community piece. There are other people who do that. The partnerships need to be forged. Our Code Red organization is trying to do this. It's a bunch of people who love to develop research questions and evaluate things. And there are people on the ground who are doing the work. They don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time evaluating it because they like doing the client service provision, but they would like to know whether what they're doing works. We don't need to all learn how to do each other's stuff. We just need to partner. The second piece is professionalization, and this speaks to the whole counter programming question. If your passion is to provide that amazing counter programming where you're telling people, you're engaging young people and providing them opportunities, what else to do other than picking up the gun, right? That needs to be a professional role that we recognize in society. It should be There are lots of different variations of this from people who are credible messengers, et cetera. Those jobs need to be professionalized. There needs to be a way that we are adequately compensating and recognizing and training and providing peer support the way you would for any other professional role, for a social worker, for a physician, for whatever. Because too much of the time we rely on the goodwill of community members to, in their spare time, provide that counter messaging with the young people that they have relationship with, and that we're not adequately recognizing the burden of work that is. So if we say, if you're a peer counselor, that's a professional role. It's plugged into the local school of social work or the local school of criminology. It has certifications and peer support mechanisms, and it is adequately compensated. We can create a body of professionals whose whole job is counter messaging, right? Those people already exist, but they are doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. And that's not sustainable. So those are my thoughts as to solutions for that.
Thank you. I think we actually have a pretty good running list, and I suspect you all might have more, but there's one question that I want to make sure we get to, and then we can have, a few minutes of free-flowing conversation if you all have other thoughts before we get to Q&A. But whenever we talk about guns and the gun violence epidemic, the third rail is always legislative and policy solutions. It seems like we've all sort of become kind of resigned to any controls on gun access or ownership just being non-starters. So, and I wonder, is that even true, or is that a part of the sort of, myth making that happens around the gun violence problem? So I pose this question to everybody. In your opinion, are policy and legislative solutions doomed to fail? Is the gun lobby too powerful? Is the Second Amendment too sacrosanct? Or are there missed opportunities that, are just sort of out there just because we're afraid to tackle the issue? Anyone feel free to dive in on that one.
I'm happy to start with that one.
Sure.
I think we can't give up the ship when it comes to policies. And I think it's important to stick to our guns, no pun intended, around the type of policies we think work. So some of the policies that have been shown to be most effective are the most controversial, but they're the most effective. So we need to keep saying that over and over again. And, I think that there are a lot of things that I always think about, like Dr. King in these moments. So a lot of things that I think have happened that I think his generation would not have imagined possible. And so we can't continue to give up on the seemingly impossible when it comes to true legislative change at every level, from local to federal. Having said that, one of the ways we've been reorienting our thinking and policies is around asset-based policies. And so in Philadelphia, we're preempted against, for example, passing local gun laws. We can't have a local permit to purchase law. We're not allowed to do that by the state. But we can legislate all we want around the built environment, around education access, around all of these other assets. And so one place where we can maybe put our foot on the gas without restrictions is in the assets that are preventative. And I do think that that's really important. I think sometimes there's this kind of false dichotomy between things that will bring violence down now that involve getting guns off the street right now, which I think are important, and also, changing the structural environment and the society in which people who are exposed to a lot of violence are living. I think I think it's both and, right? I think we have to address these big, deep problems: structural racism, lack of access to education, poverty, lack of access to employment, at the same time that we address, this cohort of people who are actively engaged in violence in the near term. And we can do a lot of stuff on that first issue, the deeper issues that take a long time to fix. We can legislate around that. And we're not preempted on that. So that would be my perspective there.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I mean, I don't. So I may make some folks uncomfortable, but I made it very clear. You're not going to legislate yourself out of this situation. We've always had guns in our community. The numbers just increased. Around COVID, people know a lot of money hit the street, and the street said, we're going to sell folks guns, right? That was part of the, the street knows how to operate. And so it really, we gave access to guns to many people who never even had the guns were there, but never had the money, to do that. And so a lot of money poured into the street, a lot of money poured into the hands of individuals to get guns. And so, my position has always been that, it has been the immediacy and the certainty that if you carry a gun in the city of Philadelphia, what's going to happen to you? So if we can't address, if we're not even on the same page as entities in the city as to what happens when someone has a gun and what should happen to them, in that regard, then we can bring in all the legislative, things that we want to bring into play. It's not going to happen. And I'm talking about the now, right? Because somebody described me, when we have a policy that we're not worried about, we're not going to address guns, we're going to deal with the shooter of that weapon. To me, even from a public health perspective, Dr. Abaya, I don't know if I would get out of line, that I would wait for somebody to shoot somebody before I would address the fact that they had a gun and that would kill that person. So Roxborough, if I describe the incident at Roxborough, where 5 young people who will spend, many of them will spend possibly the rest of their lives in prison, had been stopped and had gotten those guns and taken them off the street. And yes, there may have been some certainty and some immediacy. And I'm not talking about the severity. I'm not saying that someone has to be put away for the next 8 years, 6 years, 2 years, or 5. Well, we know that there's enough studies around that. If we don't have a policy that says that if you can't, you have to get a gun illegally, carry it illegally, and use it illegally. And we focus solely on the guns, but we forget about the number of gunpoint robberies and other assaults and activity that goes with gun usage. And so, before we even get to that other rail around, and we really need to figure out as a city, where we stand when it comes to carrying. And this conversation that, we say that, oh, well, folks are carrying guns because they're scared. And so this is the reason why, that just gives a message to our young people. Oh, okay. So our adults are saying, I'm scared, so I can carry a gun. And I listen, and I know that counters some of the conversations that folks feel about that. But we have to get back to a place that we tell individuals that carrying a gun, it comes with some certainty of action when you carry a gun in the city of Philadelphia. And until we get to that place, the legislators in Harrisburg are going to sit there looking at you all day like, well, you're not even dealing with what you have on the books now. So why are we going to give you more when you're not even dealing with the issues you have now?
So I think that what you said, Kevin, raises interesting questions about knowledge gaps that we may or may not have. So for a long time, one of the things that hasn't happened in the United States is a lot of research around gun violence, period. It just hasn't happened. So the question of whether or not increasing consequences for carrying a gun in fact decreases gun violence is, for me, an open question. I don't know if it's empirically an open question. It's for me an open question. Is there actually a deterrent effect in knowing that there are severe punitive consequences that cause shootings to go down? That might be a research question. The second thing that you said was, young people are carrying guns. Young people carrying guns because they're scared might be, perpetuating the cycle of young people choosing to carry guns. That to me is also an open question. I don't know if there's any research anyone has heard that either confirms or.
We're not making that a statement. I'm just saying that I've been in many locations in meetings now where people say that, right?
Yeah.
But
they're interesting questions to figure out, right? Like, I think they're not unwarranted questions. Like,
right.
We do.
And just be cautious. I caution about the severity. So I'm not sitting there saying that when you say that, but there has to be consequences and there has to be some action taken. I'd rather take a 14-year-old child who was one of the kids locked up for Roxborough, and be dealing with him and where he had a gun and he maybe is going to Andre's program and working with him to come to understand that, versus that child now being in a place where, he's never going to see, at the outside again.
Right. Well, and so that's the question as well, right? Like how severe a consequence actually produces a change in behavior? Does it? Is there a proportionate better response the more severe the consequence?
But I believe, I just my final thing, but I believe there is a study that talks about this, the recidivism for someone who's carrying a gun and what happens in that case as well. And so we can't ignore the data that talks about you know, what that looks like. And I'm not saying that's everyone, but, you know.
Right.
Okay.
Kevin, we have this fight all the time offline. We're not going to expose these folks to our little our little squabble that we always have. But I definitely want other folks to jump in before we get carried away. Are there any other solutions? And you've gotten quite a few that I've made note of so far. Are there any other solution-oriented focus areas that you all can think of that we haven't covered? And if not, I'm inviting each of you to very briefly give, you know, a closing thought that you might have before we get to audience questions.
I can jump in. I love that Kevin said that we can't legislate ourselves out of this problem. I wish we spent the amount of time, energy, and resources that we spend, you know, trying to legislate ourselves out of these problems and understanding the root causes and asking why, asking these real questions that you're posing, Marie, because I feel like you are highlighting some questions that we really need to address. You know, I feel like there needs to be a lot more research done, not only about the root causes, about ancestral trauma and healing. You know, this gun violence is only a manifestation of what's happening inside of us, inside of the community. We're hurting as a people. You know, we've been hurting, and we're seeing the culmination of a lot of cultural barriers, a culmination of a lot of oppression that is just manifesting itself in the streets of Philadelphia right now. And so for a final word, I think we need to all wake up and ask ourselves, what is one thing we can do today, you know, to support our community, you know, and work towards that. And we have to continue to have these conversations and come together and, you know, work towards real solutions and be open-minded and not closed-minded, have, you know, the opportunity to listen and hear out and really understand what's going on.
Thanks for that, Andre. Nikki, do you want to go next with a closing thought?
Sure. And just to respond as well, I mean, there are all deterrent theories that talk about swiftness and severity and certainty. And certainly there needs to be a lot more research. My hope is that we move away from one thing versus the other. We can do things in parallel. And while we're asking for more research, which there has been foundations out there over the last 4 years, I would say, that have put a lot of money, a lot more money into gun violence research, and the federal government has stepped up and is being responsive. But what do we do now? And what does that look like now? And what are the conversations that need to happen now is also important. And so we get lost sometimes with saying we need more of one thing, and we forget that we also need to address things in the immediate future. So my hope is that, and I work in the police department again, but I'm very much into community having a voice. And I genuinely think we cannot solve this issue unless we bring those who are impacted to the conversation and around the table. And so as we move forward, as we think about solutions, we need to see who's missing from that table and ensure that their voice is there.
Thank you, Nikki. Ruth, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I'll share just a quick story in closing, which was part of how I got into this work. There are a couple of stories in my fellowship years. One of them was I got in the habit of asking my adolescents who came into the ER in trouble for some reason what they wanted to be when they grew up. And one of the most memorable responses was a young man from North Philly who said he had no expectation of growing up. And so that has stuck with me. I think it's hard to overstate how much trauma that statement reflects. And this, you know, he was very young, and this was his expectation based on what he had seen unfold in his community for a really long time. So, you know, we've talked a lot about research, but the amount of just important data that's just in the stories, I think Andre pointed out, which is that we really need to be getting these stories because they help us understand carriage practices and all of these other behaviors that ultimately contribute to violence. And they help us understand just the human stories behind them. So I just want to, I guess, as a solution, uplift what Dr. Nikki said, that we need to bring in the information that comes from the stories. And then we need to be really cognizant of just the profound amount of trauma that some of these young people are living with.
Thank you, Ruth. Kevin, any other thoughts?
I think I would just echo what everyone said. I just would double down what Dr. Abaya did talked about research. I mean, we know what's going on. We just got to get to work. You know, we got to get focused and get laser focused on the work. I mean, because we can't, you know, we know, right? We know what the research says, as he indicated. We know what we need to do. Folks going to have to humble themselves, check their egos at the door, and get to work.
Yep. Thank you for that. So I know there are folks in the audience who are probably chomping at the bit to have their questions answered. And I think we're going to have, I don't know, we have at least 10 or 15 minutes for that. So Mark, are there any questions out there right now?
Sure, yes, we have just a few questions today. First one comes from Tuishi Joy Abney at Hero. It is, how do community organizations like mine partner with schools or the School District of Philadelphia to support middle and high school students?
I don't know if I'm the perfect person to talk about, because I'm not sure at what level, Mark, and where they're coming in, the point of entry, whether that's on the support services. But I'd be more to share my contact information, Mark. You're more than glad to share that with the questioner, unless they wanted to clarify. Because I mean, you know, there are multiple opportunities now to come into the district to support. Many outside agencies are doing that, so I can definitely be a liaison to point them in the right direction.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Next question comes from Dan Romer. Apologies for the pronunciation of the last name. This one's for Ruth specifically. Dan says, great summary. Do you as a director of research in Philadelphia have the resources that you need to do effective research?
So first I would say, Dan, that you promoted me. So I don't know that I can at all claim that title, but I think that in general, research in gun violence is under-resourced. And I agree with Dr. Nikki that there have been promising signs in recent years, and under the Biden administration, there have been some promising kind of state level funding, which is great. But it's very hard, right? I think sometimes it feels hard to justify spending money on asking questions when there's so much kind of practical work that needs to be done. And so there needs to be an agreement, I think, as a society about what are we asking questions about? What do we think those answers are going to yield, so that we can increase the amount that we are committing to this. I think it's exciting what's opened up and the state and federal level. But I think when you look at it relative to other public health issues with similar morbidity and mortality, we are still woefully behind. And it's very tempting to get really excited about what is ultimately relatively small amounts of money, because kind of nothing was happening since the mid-1990s. And so it feels like more, and it is more, and that's great. But I don't think that, I think advocating for better funding for research from all sources is going to be a priority for the near term.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Ruth. So the next question comes from Victoria Gins at PCA. Victoria says, family, friends, classmates, etc., who overhear teens and young adults talking about possessing guns, who should they call for help to talk to these kids about the consequences?
We have a fellowship of youth leaders at YES that would be great with that. We have a participatory.
Andre, can you speak up a little bit? It's a little hard to hear you.
I'm sorry. We have a fellowship of youth leaders at YES that run our participatory defense hub, and I'm sure they will be more than willing to lend their voice, lend their guidance and leadership. A lot of us at YES have been impacted directly by violence or the criminal legal system, and so yeah, I think that would be a great connection to make. You can share my information.
So we've had a couple of questions now where, folks would do well to connect directly with the panelists. So rest assured that we'll communicate with you all after the webinar is over with, and, getting in touch with the panelists will not be a problem. We'll make sure you're able to do that if you need to.
Thanks, Marie. Next question comes from Mike Waller at United Way. Mike says, what do you think about the cure violence model for violence prevention, and should it be adopted wholesale throughout Philadelphia?
I'm happy to take that one. So the health department hosts a coalition of cure violence programs, of which there are 4 discrete ones that we've identified. As you probably know, I think it was in 2017, there was some good evidence around a reduction in shooting incidents that was attributable to cure violence in Philadelphia. So I think there's evidence that it has potential to work. The purpose of the coalition, though, is to try to identify where it is and what its current impact and reach is. I will also say that cure violence has been, I think, undergoing a national metamorphosis. So it has a very specific identity that probably needs to be adapted to local environments. So the other goal of our coalition is to say, okay, how does cure violence in Philadelphia work? Who are the relevant, credible messengers? It's going to look different in South Philly than it is in North Philly. It's going to be a completely different thing in Kensington, a completely different thing in West Philly, and that's probably appropriate. So how do we look at implementation in those different settings and then determine what the relevant outcomes are, and establish some best practices, but with enough flexibility to do good work in completely different environments. So I think lots of promise, confirmed evidence of effectiveness, but lots of room to grow and expand.
And Mark, if I could double down, we are through a grant through the Neubauer Foundation. We did work with Cure Violence. We're initiating a youth violence reduction program at Bartram. Through that feeder grant, we were able to get a grant from OJDP to implement a program where we're using the elements of Cure Violence. And actually going to put it into one of our school. We're having some challenges now as well to do exactly what Dr. Abaya, what does it look like in a school setting? Put in the tool to see, how's it work in that setting? But we're really reaching out now to see how we can start to bring those kind of violent interrupter models into our school system, where we're seeing, particularly in particular schools where we see a high level of gang activity, a large number of kids being shot or killed from that school. And how can we, work, to support our school community in a better way?
And I'll just add, Mark, as well, and I'm happy with what Kevin just said, and it goes back to my previous point about this branding of interventions. And there needs to be conversation around what the mechanisms behind these interventions are, and ensuring that these mechanisms are implemented, whether it be cure violence or advanced peace or whatever. We keep using the brand names and funding based on these brand names, when we should really be looking at the mechanisms and implementing those across different issue areas.
That's a good point. Thank you for that.
You got all of our heads nodding with you on that one, Dr.
Thank you. Next question comes from the Samuel S. Fells Fund. The Fells Fund writes, I appreciate this forum and everyone who is participating. Dr. Abaya mentioned the abundance of trauma, but very little has been said about trust. What do you think needs to happen beyond acknowledgement to build trust, especially of the police?
Nikki, I sort of feel like you, because you sit there now, and maybe Kevin, because you still sit in the police department.
It goes back to what I said earlier. Until we are ready to, 1, acknowledge, and 2, have some truth-telling conversations, nothing will change. And so that's something we're working on within the police department as well, and redefining what community means, because I'm always intrigued by the idea around this us versus them when it comes to police and community. Again, coming from the Caribbean, the police is a part of the community. If you talk to older residents in Philadelphia and anywhere around the country, the police was a part of the community, and we've moved away from that. But saying all that to say, we need to get back to having authentic, intentional conversations on a consistent basis, not as a checkbox. Because what I'm recognizing as well, some of these conversations are checkboxes. There's no follow-up, there's no follow-through, and that needs to change. So I would say, again, authentic, hard conversations, and we need to prepare folks to have these conversations and to just listen sometimes. And so we've started some of that. I mentioned earlier, our procedurally just youth engagement, where we used fishbowl style. We had youth in the center, officers around the periphery, and the officers were simply not allowed to say anything. They needed to hear the reality of a 14-year-old saying, yeah, I have to take a gun because I need to protect myself. Or I was told from I was in 2nd grade that I won't get anywhere. These are the realities of what's happening on the ground in Philadelphia. And until we have those conversations, we won't recognize and realize that we're really all, in many situations, experiencing the same thing and really want the same goal. So truth-telling conversations.
Yeah, I would I agree with what Dr. Nikki said, but also say, you know, to what Dr. Abaya said earlier around expanding the definition of what trust is. Because I oftentimes, you know, we constantly are saying that the community doesn't trust the police. We beat that drum, but have we really dissected? You know, they tell me that they don't like my school safety officers, but when I do a survey and 80% of the respondents say we trust the school safety officers, I'm like, well, wait a minute. You keep telling me that, you know, they're not, but I can tell you that the kids tell me that they are, you know, and so sometimes I think it really, because, you know, this policing has been the tip of the system for a long time. I think sometimes that trust is, or lack of trust is not just about the entity of policing, but the system overall. It is the one piece of the system that they can see and touch every day. And sometimes it bears all of the weight of, do we really trust the judge? Do we really trust? I think all of us can go across a whole number of different professions that we don't trust them. We don't trust them, but we seem to really, and I think sometimes it makes it an easy foil to just constantly saying, you know, to beat the drum that the community doesn't trust the police, the community doesn't trust the police. And I understand that. I understand it on a more macro way and I understand all of the things that go behind that. But there are many people in our community who really, really appreciate the men and women who serve them, and the people who serve them want to do well. And so I think part of us as an entity have to, are you ever going to give an opportunity for them, a law enforcement or safety, to be trusted? You know, and that's going to take a larger conversation.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Evan. I think we have time for one more. Sorry, Marie, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, let's get to as many as we can. I don't know how many you're seeing. I'm only seeing about 3 more. If we can get to those, that would be great. Depending.
Sure,
so,
absolutely.
So the burden being on the panel is to answer briefly when you answer, please, so we can get
just wanted to.
Good luck to you. Yeah, so the first question comes from Frank Servone, Support Center for Child Advocates. Frank writes, can you expand on the needed content of youth work? What elements and timeframes should programs include? And what do you think of evaluation to determine what works rather than simply throwing the next good idea at youth and their families?
Good luck answering that briefly, anyone, but give it a shot.
I think I think that Andre is definitely the most expert in answering this question. The only thing I would say is that the content should be dictated by the youth. So I think that the biggest mistake we can make is assuming. And I think that the way that we achieve developing content for youth programming that is relevant is to not just give the youth a seat at the table by consulting with them once in a focus group, but giving them an actual paid, recognized role in our violence prevention efforts, where they are constantly informing our efforts in their various iterations. So that's the only perspective I have.
Yeah, I'm glad that you touched on that. I definitely think it's super important that we source young people in developing the content, because more often than not, the solutions are going to be there. For me personally, I can't speak on behalf of all young people, but it was extremely impactful once I understood my history, and not the history they taught me in school, but my history as a Black African in America, and understanding the history of, you know, the systems that, you know, make up our country and make up my neighborhood. I think that was very impactful in, you know, my journey moving forward. But first and foremost, like, we have to sit youth down and allow them to tell us what they need.
Thank you.
All right. A second to last question comes from Maya Stallings. She says, for someone who works in implementation science, what is the best way to have my organization get into the work of evaluating and working with community organizations?
For the sake of time, I'm happy to say something briefly, but people should feel free to interrupt me. I guess the one thing I would say is I think this works best when it's hyper local. So if you're working in West Philly and you know the organizations in West Philly, and those are the people who are in your community and going to the same grocery stores and attending the same places of worship, I think that has the greatest potential for longevity and success. There are lots of ways we're working on an asset map right now that hopefully would help people find who's around them. But prior to that, I think there are other ways to find out, like, who are the organizations that you work with, or who are the organizations that are near you that you might be able to support in measuring the implementation and impact of their work. Some of that is, feel free to connect to the health department. We're happy to do our best to create those connections. Some of it is finding out who those, like, for example, pastors and imams and local leaders are, block captains, because they know who's doing the work. And making those relationships and having those connections. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
All right, last question comes from Jay Reed. Jay says, as a national partner who looks to work with the mayor's office and city leads to connect with the CBOs, community-based organizations, how can we better frame our messaging and getting buy-in from the city and community?
That's a really tough and important question. And I swear I'm not punting, Jay, when I say that you should join our next webinar, which is going to be focused on communicating about gun violence and the gun violence problem. And you're going to hear a lot of really interesting and provocative speakers that tell us the ways in which we're not doing it perfectly now and can certainly improve. Having said that, any other panelists want to weigh in other than what I've just said? All right. Well, if not, I'm going to thank all our panelists for joining us, especially so late in the day. I can see the eyelids are getting a little bit heavy, despite how engaging the conversation has been. Nikki has said that she thinks there's plenty more conversation to be had, and we certainly agree with that. But for now, I'm going to toss it to Stoneleigh's Executive Director, Ronnie Bloom, to say a few closing words. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Marie. I am Ronnie Bloom, the Executive Director, the proud Executive Director of the Stoneleigh Foundation. And on behalf of the Foundation's staff and board, I'd like to thank our outstanding group of panelists. Andre, Nikki, Kevin, and Ruth, you engaged us in such a candid and robust dialogue this afternoon. You've not only given us important food for thought, but also a clear call to action for how to address the crisis in the short, medium, and long terms. We're really honored to count you among our fellows, our board members, and grantees. And we really, really appreciate the time that you've taken today to share your experiences and your expertise with us. I know I certainly learned an awful lot, and I've talked with a number of you quite a bit, but I learned an awful lot today, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sure those in the audience did as well. And thank you also to Stoneleigh's Deputy Director, Marie Williams, for your stellar moderation. Today's webinar was the first in a series of events focused on addressing Philadelphia's gun violence epidemic. If you haven't already registered, as Marie already put a plug in, we encourage you to join us on Tuesday, December 6th, for our second virtual convening focused on changing the narrative on gun violence and the role of media. Finally, in concert with this series, we're also currently recruiting for our next cohort of Emerging Leader Fellowships. We're seeking applications from nonprofit, academic, and public sector organizations that are interested in hosting an Emerging Leader Fellowship focused very specifically on addressing gun violence from a policy, practice, research, advocacy, or communication lens. Applications are due by January 13th. So please have a look at our website to learn more. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for joining us today, and please stay tuned for information about our upcoming events.